Hello again. It might seem almost beyond belief, but for the BBC this morning, the most important item of news is that they might have identified a dead man who was possibly involved in the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. The headline to the piece on the BBC, to which I give a link in the description to this video, suggests that this was Britain's most notorious racist murder, which, of course, neatly sidesteps the death of PC Keith Blakelock in 1985 during the Broadwater Farm riot in Tottenham, and also the murder of Lee Rigby just 10 years ago, which, like the death of Stephen Lawrence, took place in South London. What is it with the death of Stephen Lawrence which means that he can never be forgotten by the BBC, anti-racists or left-wingers? Is it that when he died 30 years ago, people being stabbed to death in the street in that way was still by way of being a novelty? Or is it that he enabled a hatchet job to be done on the Metropolitan Police so that they became, in the eyes of many, as guilty of the murder as the thugs who actually wielded the knives? Or could it be, and this is the explanation which I myself favour, that it introduced to the wider public the concept of institutional racism, a phrase which has now become something of a catchphrase for the liberal left? An inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence led to the publication in 1999 of the Macpherson Report, which first revealed to most people the concept of institutional racism. Not that institutional racism was a new idea, it had been floating about in the United States for decades, being coined originally by black militant Stokely Carmichael. Academics in this country had discussed the idea for a long while before the death of Stephen Lawrence, but of course in a sensible and low-key way. Here, for example, is a book published by the Open University Press in 1986. Almost 40 years ago. I've had that for a long while, which details the theory of institutional racism and explores the idea critically in a sensible fashion. It might be worth remembering that at least 4 theories of what might be meant by the concept were floating around years before the death of Stephen Lawrence. Let me just read out these 4 theories, and remember that this was written, in the mid-1980s. There would seem to be at least 4 meanings which could be attributed to institutional racism. They are as follows. 1. Although institutions are not governed by psychological racists or by believers in racist theory, they may be subject to unconscious racism. 2. Discrimination on racial grounds exists, but is difficult to prove. The most important proof of its existence, however, is in the outcome in terms of black or minority disadvantage. 3. The reasons why blacks do badly out of ordinary market processes are hard to understand, and their outcome difficult to rectify except by intervening in market processes to ensure that some blacks do well. 4. Discrimination on racial grounds does not exist, but the important fact is that the disadvantaged poor suffer, and that a high proportion of the black population are to be found amongst the disadvantaged poor. Now, of course, all this is very sensible, and few of us would argue that race and class are linked, and the fact that most black people in this country belong to the working class, many to the disadvantaged poor, as is described here, and that few are middle class, is bound to have an effect on their prospects and so on. As far as it goes, the idea of institutional racism is a very productive one. It's something that we could look at and perhaps work out what's actually going on. However, this kind of thing is not at all what is meant today when people talk of institutional racism. Instead, it has come to mean that various public bodies, such as the police, are actually working in a racist fashion, denying black people justice and even actively oppressing them. In other words, this or that institution, whether the police, fire brigade or the National Health Service, is full of racists. This is not at all what Stokely Carmichael had in mind, and this view of institutional racism really emerged with the Macpherson report. I think this is why the BBC is so keen to revive interest in the murder of Stephen Lawrence, as a way of reminding everybody that racism is still alive and well, and that the Metropolitan Police is still as institutionally racist as ever. If only some of these people could understand what institutional racism actually means and be prepared to enter into a calm and sensible discussion about it, it would be no bad thing for community cohesion in this country.